Once again, welcome to our Animal Justice Academy event, Infighting in the Animal Advocacy Movement with Dr. Melanie Joy. She's an award-winning psychologist and educator. She's the author of 7 books, including the best-selling Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, Beyond Beliefs, and her very new book, folks, How to End Injustice Everywhere. Her work has been featured in major media outlets around the world. She's been given a number of awards, including the Ahimsa Award, which was previously given to the Dalai Lama and Nelson Mandela, no biggie, for her work on global nonviolence. Melanie has given talks and trainings in over 50 countries, and she's also the founding president of the international NGO Beyond Carnism, and leads the work at the Center for Effective Vegan Advocacy. And you can learn more about her work. We dropped the links for both those organizations in the chat. Melanie, you are such an AJA or fan favorite. Your module, How to Navigate Animal Rights with Family, Friends, and Colleagues in the course, probably got the most views out of the entire course. So welcome, you're a hero.
Oh, thank you. Well, the admiration is mutual. I'm so thrilled to be here, and I loved our conversation last time. And I'm just like watching the chat blow up with people from all over the world, feeling like really, really inspired and really excited. So anyway, thank you. Thank you so much. And we'll just jump right in.
Absolutely.
I got a lot to
go
cover.
ahead, Melanie. So I'll give folks, so this is a talk, and as Melanie's go ahead setting up, we're basically handing the floor over to her because this talk that she gives is unbelievable, and we're so lucky to have it here. So we are going to basically let Melanie do her thing, keep the chat going, and again, we will try to fit in a couple of questions at the end. I'll sort of keep track of what's going on. All right, it's all yours,
Great.
Melanie.
Thank you. I am really, really so excited to see a lot of people are here for this, as Kimberly pointed out, really, really important conversation. I have a lot to cover. But I want to really just start out, or I actually had wanted to start out by asking your opinion. And I was going to ask, how concerned about infighting are you on a scale of 1 to 10? But I don't need to do that now because Kimberly read my mind. I wasn't surprised to see the results. No, that was actually perfect. As you were doing it, I was excited. So thank you. And just, you can see my slide, one slide right now is showing, filling the whole screen. Okay, perfect. Love it when the technology works. So yeah, and I have been all around the world. I've been to over 50 countries now, talking about veganism, talking about carnism, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And, what I have heard over and over again is that, vegans around the world say that infighting is really a top concern, and it sometimes even causes them more stress or more distress in animal agriculture when they're thinking about it. We know that infighting is wasting huge amounts of resources, and it's really significantly reducing the impact of our movement. And our estimates, and this is really conservative, and I have all of the stats for this, I should say, this webinar, all of the stats are on a website that we're going to launch next week called infighting.org, and I'll talk about that more later on. But we've estimated that infighting costs the farm to animal advocacy movement about 20 million a year. I think it's actually a lot more than that. And basically, our toxic communication is driving committed vegans out of the movement. It is turning off non-vegans, and it's reducing the effectiveness in teams and organizations. And a lot of vegans say that they really feel a sense of betrayal. And this is one of the most painful aspects of infighting for them. And, many of us are well aware that as we fight among ourselves, the global atrocity we're supposed to be working to end is just continuing to wreak devastation. So it's almost as if we're like a crew on a lifeboat, right? Like surrounded by drowning animals and trying to save as many as possible, while some of the crew are shooting holes in the bottom of the boat. But there really is good news, and that is that we are not helpless to end the problem of infighting. A key reason why infighting has been and continues to be a problem is simply because we haven't focused on addressing it. For a lot of people, it's like this feeling of it being an abstraction. It's like such a big thing, and like, where do we even begin? And so what I'm really excited about is I spent the past couple of years doing a deep dive into all things infighting. And we have a new project at my organization, Beyond Carnism, the End Infighting Project, where we very, very clearly delineate or explain the key causes of infighting, the key consequences and costs of infighting, and specific tools that anybody can use and apply to immediately become proactive in helping to end the problem. When we understand what infighting is, what causes it, and what the principles and tools are for preventing and managing it, we can really immediately become proactive in resolving the problem. And that gives me personally a lot of hope. So what I'm going to talk about today is we'll look a little bit at what infighting is, and we'll talk about some of the key causes of infighting and some of the costs of infighting. And I'll share some resources with you for further learning, and I'll have tips and tools kind of interspersed throughout this webinar. Now, there is a good chance that you'll see yourself in some of the examples I share of problematic behaviors that contribute to infighting, and that's because you're human. And these behaviors are really, they're normal, they're really widespread, and we all engage in them. So just please be compassionate toward yourself and don't cancel yourself. Like, even if you've done a lot of what I'm going to talk about, that doesn't erase all of the good that you've done with your advocacy. So let's talk about what infighting is. And we'll start by talking about what infighting is not. Infighting is not in disagreeing, okay? Disagreements about various issues are really essential for creating a diverse and impactful movement. Now, some of these disagreements are particularly important, like when women or BIPOC and so on challenge imbalances of power in the movement. And we have to be really careful not to refer to these healthy challenges that are helping a movement evolve as infighting, or we could be weaponizing the whole concept and then silencing critical voices. Basically, infighting is exactly the same as what we could call outfighting, as any kind of fighting, right? Except that it's directed toward members of one's own group, and there's no surprise there. What's important to appreciate, though, is that the same attitudes and behaviors that drive us apart are those that drive others away from our message, and that also drive injustice more broadly. What this means is that when we understand how to stop infighting, we also understand how to more effectively advocate veganism and to contribute to ending all injustices. And this will become clear when I start to talk about the key causes. Now, infighting is, as most of you probably know, is a problem on both levels of the movement, okay? It's a problem on the level of the movement as a whole, right, between activists and advocates around the world. And it's also a problem in the organizational level, right? It's a problem within organizations when teams, people in teams are fighting with each other, and when organizations fight each other, like competing for resources, for example. In general, we fight when we have a difference of opinion or need from someone, and we use aggression to try to get them to change. And when I say aggression, I am not talking about punching them in the face so we get our way. Most of the aggression that is used is so subtle that we don't even realize that it's aggression. And nevertheless, it has very problematic impact on us. So, we've all heard this before. There are lots and lots of ways that we talk to and about other vegans that are less than charitable and that sort of water the seeds of shame and problematic behaviors and feelings in the movement. Now, what we refer to as infighting is often, this is particularly on the movement-wide level, it's often not actually a fight. A fight implies that there are two or more sides attacking each other, right? Very often, though not always, it's one party using their platform or their power to attack another. So this is actually more accurately referred to as bullying. Now, when we think about most infighting that actually happens, it's happening in teams, it's happening on a much more subtle level, that's not quite the same as bullying. But the more extreme fighting in the movement is really driven largely by a vocal minority of vegans who are supported by a silent majority. So many of us do not recognize the toxic behaviors that drive infighting for what they are, that we allow them to continue and provide a platform for the people who are really engaging in these behaviors. The less extreme fighting is really the result of vegans just simply not realizing that the way that they're relating, which includes communicating, is fueling the problem. And we're going to clear that up today. Now, vegans often attack other vegans when they believe that the other vegans are weakening the movement, right? Whenever we hear infighting, you guys, I'm sure, can relate to this. It's like, oh my God, you're harming animals. You're bad for the movement. And usually the focus is on two key areas. One is how vegans should interpret and relate to our ideology. What does it mean to be vegan? And the other is what kind of outreach is the most appropriate? What is the ask, and how should we make this ask? This could be a whole presentation in and of itself, but just briefly to give some examples. When we think about ideology, a key argument is usually around the question, how should veganism be understood and practiced, right? So for example, are you really a vegan if you wear used leather? Who gets to call themselves a vegan? And what does it mean to be a vegan? And it makes sense that we have different ideas about our ideology. It's normal. I mean, ideologies, belief systems are constructed at a certain point in time, in a certain context, by certain people, and these factors are always changing, right? So think about how Muslims and Christians and capitalists and Marxists and Democrats and Republicans and so on, I mean, they inevitably have different ideas about the core principles of their respective ideologies. The problem is not our differences. It's how we relate to the differences. And that's what we're going to be talking here. I'm not here to answer, offer quote unquote solutions to these differences, because those solutions come from collective dialogue. We talked also about how the other focus of infighting is typically on outreach methods. Now, a lot of arguing about which outreach method, which form of advocacy to use is based on vegans' subjective, experience and opinions. Like a lot of us tend to think, understandably, well, this worked for me, so it must work for everybody. Somebody said to me, go vegan, and I went vegan. Somebody showed me earthlings and I went vegan. Or we might think well, this feels so impactful when we're really worked up at a demo on the street, so it must be impactful. And then we end up arguing, but we're really just arguing against each other's subjective opinions. Dialogue and learning how to dialogue is a critical way to manage this piece of the problem, and really knowing which methods have been scientifically proven to work that really are evidence-based can go a long way to ending this arguing. I mean, there's a lot more research that we need, but there's a lot of research that's been done. So instead of, here's my opinion, we can really look at what has the science shown to be effective? What have our own measurements have shown to be effective? We have a course at the Center for Effective Vegan Advocacy called The Science of Effective Vegan Advocacy, where I talk about a handful of the most common and most important methods that have a empirical basis for them. Now, despite the importance of having a diversity of opinions and also a diversity of outreach methods, I mean, not all outreach methods are, as equally effective, of course, but we do need a diversity of opinions and approaches in the movement. A lot of vegans fear that if we're not united, we're divided. And I hear this all the time from vegans. They get this belief causes us to feel triggered by our differences and feel like we have to crush them. We have to present this united front to the rest of the world and also to each other. And we feel very uncomfortable with our differences. But as I mentioned, our diversity is our strength. And it's important to remember that animal exploitation industries want us to fight each other. And framing our differences as divisive is a really effective way to fuel infighting and get us to do their job for them. So we're going to jump now to look at and this is the largest section of this webinar, which is the causes of infighting, and interspersed through these causes, I'll talk about ways to manage some of the problems. And I'm going to share with you what I believe are, I think it's 7 key causes of infighting. There are a lot more, but one of them is that, but these are the key ones. One of them is saying, no, this is a surprise, but vegans are people. And people tend to fight when they have a difference of opinion or need. And this is because most vegans, like most people, have a low level of relational literacy, which is the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating. Most of us haven't gotten a single lesson in how to communicate effectively and how to relate in a way that helps us to be more connected and cultivate mutual understanding. Another reason is that the change strategy that we've inherited is counterproductive. The change strategy is the strategy or method we use to try to get other people to change their attitudes or behaviors. A third reason is that or a fourth reason is that we're really angry for good reason. And I'm going to, by the way, I'm listing these now, and I'm going to talk about each one of them in turn. We also have high rates of something called dysregulation. This is when our nervous system is out of balance. And we have high rates of something called secondary traumatic stress. A lot of us have been traumatized by what we've seen and what we know is going on. There's also the problem of false information, like disinformation in the movement, just like there is in the broader culture. This is in green because we're not going to talk about it. We're just going to talk about the first 6. And we're activists, and activists take action. And when we see something we disagree with, we see something we're not happy with, we are not people who sit back and just let it continue. We jump in and we try to fix it. And finally, a lot of us haven't learned what change strategies have been shown to work, as I mentioned earlier. So let's jump right in here and look at cause 2, which is about having a low level of relational literacy. And I'm going to explain relational literacy and its importance through sharing a very short video, a 3-minute video with you. Hopefully. Let me know if the sound.
When I was 4 years old, I killed someone. And 43 years later, I received the Ahimsa Award for my work on global nonviolence. It was a hot summer day, and I was with my parents on my father's fishing boat, my favorite place in the world to be. And then I caught my first fish. My parents clapped and laughed, but I felt distraught. My parents had instilled in me a strong commitment to practicing the golden rule, to relate to others with respect. Yet it seemed like everywhere I turned, this supposedly highest principle was being violated, and nobody was the least bit concerned. When you think about some of the most serious problems, not only in our personal lives, but also in the world, such as domestic abuse, self-harm, war, poverty, racism, patriarchy, animal exploitation, and climate change, you can see that they all share a common denominator, which is relational dysfunction or dysfunctional ways of relating. My research led me to discover that there's a specific mentality at the core of all oppressive and abusive behaviors, whether the behaviors are directed toward human or non-human beings. This formula applies to all kinds of relationships, to how social groups relate, how 2 or several individuals relate, and to how we relate to ourselves. It also applies to how we relate to other animals in the environment. The formula applies equally to brief interactions and long-term relationships. Relationships are, after all, a series of interactions. And of course, it applies to how we communicate, since communication is the primary way we relate. My research led me to recognize both the meta problem facing our world, relational dysfunction, and the meta solution to this problem, relational literacy, the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating. And I realized that all of us who are working towards social transformation have the same meta mission: to create a more relational world. Relational literacy isn't the only solution to our problems, but it's foundational to all other solutions. Personal and social transformation isn't possible if we keep our focus limited to the content. Who is oppressing or abusing whom? We need to understand and address the process, how and why we oppress and abuse in the first place. If we want to create a healthier world for everyone, we need to change the way we relate.
Okay, so I think that video covered a lot more than I could cover in 3 minutes of slides. And as I had mentioned, relational literacy is the understanding of an ability to practice healthy ways of relating. It's made up of a lot of principles and tools, but all of them are based on this one key formula. And I'm going to share the formula for healthy relating with you now, because it's central to relating in a way that helps us to build connections with each other as advocates, and to build connections with others. So in a healthy interaction or relationship, I mean, relationships are really just a series of interactions, right? We practice integrity and honor dignity. Now, I'll unpack this a little bit. When we practice integrity, we basically treat others the way that we would want to be treated if we were in their position, right? We're practicing our core moral values of compassion and justice. We're practicing respect. So we practice integrity and we honor dignity. When you honor someone's dignity, that means you think of, as well as treat them as fundamentally worthy. You recognize their inherent worth as a being on this planet. You do not think of or treat them as any less worthy of being treated with respect or of occupying space on this planet than anyone else. When we practice integrity and treating others the way we would want to be treated, and honor dignity, this leads to a sense of connection and security. So take a moment and just think about a relationship in your life that you would consider a really good relationship. Chances are you trust that that other person practices integrity toward you, that they respect you, and they honor your dignity. They see you as fundamentally worthy, not less than. And chances are you feel secure and connected with them. And like many things in life, maybe everything in life, I don't know, this formula or healthy relational dynamics don't exist. It's not an either or phenomenon. They exist on a spectrum. So an interaction or a relationship is not healthy or dysfunctional, healthy or unhealthy. It's more or less healthy or dysfunctional. On the healthy side of the spectrum are what I call relational behaviors, which I just described. On the unhealthy or dysfunctional side of the spectrum are what I call non-relational behaviors. These are behaviors that violate integrity, harm dignity, and they lead to the feeling of disconnection and insecurity. And again, if you think about an experience in your own life, a relationship with somebody, maybe it's somebody you've never met, like an online troll, who you feel is a relationship you don't feel is good, chances are you feel that person violates their integrity when they relate with you. They harm your dignity. They perceive you as less than, inferior, and you feel disconnected and insecure in that relationship. And as I mentioned in the video, this formula applies to all of our relationships. It doesn't matter how brief they are. It doesn't matter how long they are with their non-human animals, with, and even with ourselves, right? We're always relating to ourselves. And this is a really important point to be aware of. We're relating to ourselves. Our primary relationship is with ourselves. We are relating to ourselves through our self-talk. Most of us talk to ourselves in ways we would never tolerate from other people. And we're relating to ourselves through the choices that we make that impact our future selves. The more you can practice the formula toward yourself and others, the more your relationships will be connected, secure, and healthy. And you can always come back to the formula. That's the beautiful thing about it. At any moment in an interaction, when you feel like things are not going well, you can pause and ask yourself, is the formula being practiced by me or the other person? What's going on with me right now? How am I feeling? Do I feel like my dignity is being honored? Do I feel like I'm honoring somebody else's dignity? You can always come back to the formula. Now, building relational literacy is really the key. It is a fundamental key to preventing and ending infighting, because when we can relate in a way that's healthy, when we learn how to practice the formula more regularly and more fully, We can heal our relationships with other advocates and with ourselves and beyond. And we'll talk about, I will have a lot of resources for, I know it's easier said than done, but a lot of resources for very specific tools so that you can build the skills that increase the chances you will be able to practice the formula when you want to. So let's look at cause 3, which is the change strategy that we've inherited is counterproductive. I'm going to talk a little bit about this approach so you get what I'm talking about here. This approach is actually based on a long-standing and widespread set of assumptions about the best ways to get others to change behaviors and to manage differences. Now, to understand what this approach is and why it actually continues, I'm going to look at a meta-analysis that examined 40 years of studies. This was conducted by White and Miller. And this is like a massive analysis of 40 years of studies. Now, supporters of this strategy often refer to it as the confrontational approach. You may have heard of this before, right? I'm just being confrontational in my advocacy. I'm being confrontational in my communication. But to confront simply means to come face to face with something or someone or to challenge. And there are a lot of ways to confront people. So a more accurate description is the aggressive confrontational approach, because the methods of this approach are in fact based on aggression. Now, the approach began as an intervention to treat addiction in the US in the mid-20th century, and it eventually spread to influence the field of psychotherapy and then into the general public. The question being asked was, what methods get someone to stop engaging in a behavior, addiction in this case, that's causing harm to themselves and others? A question that we have as advocates as well. The people asking these questions were generally lay people. They were not professional therapists or psychotherapists. They were people who were trying to manage their own addictions, and they were mostly white, middle-class, heterosexual males, so to our knowledge. The answers they came up with were, of course, highly subjective. There were like no protocols at the time for really scientifically evaluating the effectiveness of the treatments. Now, the belief was that addiction was caused by a problem in a, quote, addict's personality, that there was some inherent character flaw that created this defensiveness against treatment. Psychotherapists were saying this, and peer groups were saying this as well. So the only way, based on this belief, to break through these defenses was with aggressive, high-volume confrontation. Like treatments included all sorts of things like ridicule, humiliation, verbal attacks, and worse. You may have heard the phrase, you got to break them down to build them up, right? And so that's where this idea came from. I should say that Alcoholics Anonymous is actually not one of the peer groups that supported this kind of aggressive confrontation. But by the 1980s, criticism of these confrontational methods, particularly when applied to more vulnerable populations like adolescents, for example, women, people of color, they led to some softening of the techniques. And then once the approach was actually scientifically, empirically tested, it was shown to be not only ineffective, but also counterproductive. It brought about the opposite outcomes of what was anticipated. What the research showed was that confrontation causes defensiveness. The defensiveness is caused by the confrontation, and it reduces the chances that the person being confronted will be receptive to change. Of course, this makes intuitive sense. However, the approach had already found its way into the mainstream. And many people today in active advocacy spaces as well believe that aggression, which is often usually in the form of shaming, is an effective way to bring about change. And a lot of infighting in the vegan space is a result of a vocal minority of vegans who actively promote aggressive confrontation as the appropriate means for vegan outreach. And I don't believe that this is done with negative intentions. This is done because this is what we've all inherited and what a lot of people believe works. And this vocal minority of vegans also attacks the vegans who disagree with them. And so this leads to ineffective advocacy as well as problems within our own movement and within our own organizations. Now, as I said, the vast majority of vegans are not doing this because they want to hurt other vegans, because they want to hurt the cause. They're doing this because they want to save animals. And we all know how urgent this calling is and this message is. Now, although a lot of people are not intentionally fueling infighting, and most people are drawn to a cause because they truly want to support it, there are other people who might be attracted to a cause for less admirable reasons. And that's really important to keep in mind, right? Now, they might be attracted to the cause because the cause provides them with an opportunity to have something to fight against, or it might be a way for them to feel morally superior or to gain power and recognition. And these people might use their platform like mainstream populist leaders do, right? They're rallying supporters by promising liberation if their particular brand of animal rights, of veganism is followed, right? While at the same time disparaging vegans who don't agree with them. And this stirs up divisions and it fuels infighting. And you know, like when someone argues that their behavior is in the service of the greater good, they can kind of get away with anything because the subtext is that if you don't agree with them, you're immoral and you're harming animals. And a lot of vegans are afraid to speak up for this reason. So attacks like this on vegans create fear and confusion throughout the movement, not just on the vegan being attacked, but on all the onlookers who are witness to this. So many vegans worry that if they're not aggressive, they're hurting the cause. If they're not supporting aggressive confrontation, they're not being tough enough. But as the authors of this study I was talking about, White and Miller, point out, getting in a person's face is rarely the best way to help them open up to new perspectives. This applies to when we're talking to non-vegans, trying to raise awareness of veganism, and of course, when we're talking to each other, when we have a difference of opinion, because we apply the aggressive confrontational approach to everybody when we've inherited it and we've adopted it. An organizational psychologist, Adam Grant, actually he explains that a change strategy that doesn't work, right? That doesn't actually change people's minds can actually strengthen their beliefs. It inoculates them against a new idea. And this is one of the reasons it's so important to avoid debating. You know, whether you're talking to a non-vegan or another vegan whose opinion you disagree with, the debate model is useful in only a small handful of situations. In a courtroom, when somebody's running for political office, for example. Otherwise, when we debate somebody, we are inviting that person to come up with all of the reasons for why their position is right and ours is wrong. Because what is the goal of a debate? To what? To win, right? Nobody wants to be the loser. So we're inviting somebody to try to be a winner. And by the end of this conversation, this debate, this other person will have spent all of their mental energy trying to find all the reasons that they're right and we're wrong, and will have probably sold themselves on their own argument. Instead, we discuss. When we discuss, our goal is not to win, which means to make the other person lose. It's not to be right, which means to make the other person wrong, and we cause less defensiveness this way. Our goal is mutual understanding. We share ideas and we try to understand multiple perspectives so we can make more informed and strategic choices. Now, I mentioned before that the primary reason that the aggressive confrontational approach is so problematic is that it's shaming, right? And to understand why shaming behaviors are so problematic, I want to be clear about what exactly shame is. And I'm going to start out by differentiating shame from guilt. Very often we use these terms interchangeably, right? We say, I feel guilty, I feel ashamed. You know, we don't really think about the difference, but they are not the same. Guilt is how we feel about a behavior. We feel guilty when we think I did something bad, right? Shame is how we feel about ourselves. We feel shame when we think I am bad. Shame is so guilt is an important emotion. Guilt is a pro-social emotion. People who don't feel guilt are people who don't course correct in their lives, right? Guilt gives us the motivation to course correct and not make the same mistake again. Because we live in such a dysfunctional world, it's a really good idea to avoid guilting people as well, because usually people's guilt immediately morphs into shame because people just can't separate these emotions and differentiate them. Shame is the feeling, I am bad. Shame is a feeling of being inferior or of being less than, specifically less worthy than. It's the feeling of being less worthy than others, of occupying space on this planet, and of being treated with respect. Shame is how we feel when our dignity has been harmed. And shame lies at the foundation of many of the problems in our world and our lives. It is an incredibly corrosive and destabilizing emotion. People who feel shame are generally not people who feel like they have the agency and the will to take proactive, action on their own or others' behalf. Usually people who feel shame withdraw from you or attack in self-defense. Now, shaming behaviors can be anything from a subtle eye roll that a vegan makes when their non-vegan dining companion chooses a hamburger over a veggie burger, or a verbal assault they make when another vegan expresses an opinion they disagree with. Virtually all of us carry around a lot of shame, thanks to the relationally dysfunctional mess of a world we've been born into. And yet we often shame other people without realizing the fact that they're already carrying a backpack that's filled with the rocks of shame that's weighing them down. And that anything we add to that is adding to a load that's already, for most people, very difficult to bear. People are highly defensive against even the threat of being shamed. When people feel, studies have shown that when people feel even the threat of being shamed, they get dysregulated, a concept I'll explain a little bit later. Their nervous system starts to go into high alert. And this means that they become less rational. They actually lose connection with their rational faculties, even if it's just a little bit, and less connected with their empathy. When you feel like somebody's going to shame you, you automatically experience them as a person who is not safe. If we want somebody to be open to reconsidering their ideas, to be reflective about their opinions, their outreach strategies, their food choices, whatever, we're asking them to be vulnerable. And if they feel that we are going to shame them, that we are looking down on them, we will not be a safe person for them to be vulnerable with. There's a significant body of literature actually on shame now, which concludes that shame has an inverse relationship with motivation to change. What this means is that when we shame people, we increase the chances that they're not going to do what we want them to do. They're not going to think what we want them to think. There were some studies that were done, they used fMRI scans, and what they found was that emotional pain, which includes feeling shame, has a similar effect on our brain as physical pain. So the brain actually does not know the difference between a harm to our dignity and our harm to our body. Now, whenever I talk about the importance of not shaming, and by the way, the more we use the formula is structured in such a way so as not to shame. A central component of the formula is honoring dignity. When we practice the formula, we are not engaging in shaming. Whenever I talk about shame, though, I hear from vegans, but there's got to be good shame. What's the difference between toxic shame and non-toxic shame? Well, if you talk to Brene Brown, who's probably the world's leading researcher on shame, she will say, and she does say, all shame is toxic shame. It is corrosive to our sense of self. People will ask me, though, is shame ever an effective way to motivate positive change? And the answer to this question is probably not. There are a few studies that suggest that maybe if you're part of a culture and that culture itself is called out, you might have a reaction that is positive. But a lot in these studies, it's usually a matter of semantics. And I would love to get into this further, but the answer is probably not. When shaming tactics seem to have brought about positive change, it's important to consider whether the change happened in spite of, rather than because of the shaming. I hear so often from vegans, well, I was shamed and I changed, so therefore shame works on me. But you may have changed sooner if you had not been changed. I mean, shame, there are a lot of factors that come into play here. And when I discuss shame with vegans, this is me. I couldn't find a stick figure of a woman on a stage getting booed, or on a stage period, actually. So this is me with the hair I wish I had. But whenever I discuss shame with vegans, I'm often confronted with like the same kind of resistance and insistence that I'm confronted with from non-vegans when I talk about eating meat. And the conversation often goes something like this. So it's like if there's any situation at all in which the behavior is justified, it just becomes a reason to keep doing it. And I share this because in my experience, there's a lot of resistance to committing to not engaging in shaming behaviors. And that is in part, I believe, in part because we are so deeply conditioned by the relationally dysfunctional mess of a world that we've been born into to believe that if we just make people feel bad enough, they'll want to change. And all of the research shows that this is not the case. And it's really, really important to appreciate this. And if we could, as a movement, make a commitment to reducing the amount of shame that we put into our movement as much as possible, I think we could transform our movement fairly quickly. Now, on a related issue, we'll talk about cause 4, which is that we're really angry. And I will say, for good reason. Our anger makes sense. We are awake to the fact that we are living in the midst of a global atrocity and a massive injustice, one of many global atrocities, I might add. And of course, we're going to feel angry. Your anger is like a sign that your moral compass is working, right? Anger is the emotional response to witnessing injustice. Anger is an incredibly important emotion. It can motivate us to take positive action on our own or others' behalf. However, how we relate to our anger is what matters. How we relate to our anger determines whether our anger is helpful in ending the injustice or toxic and therefore harmful. And I think everybody listening here probably knows what I'm talking about because you've all experienced healthy anger and you've all experienced toxic anger because we all do, because we're human. And this is a normal part of being human. Now, when we relate to our anger in a healthy way, this means that we recognize it for what it is. It is an emotion, nothing more and nothing less. It is an emotion. It is a data point for us to pay attention to. So we talk about it and we say, I'm feeling angry. You recognize it's an emotion, or better yet, a part of me is feeling angry. If you ever want to reduce the hold your anger is having on you, you can actually use this language. A part of me is feeling angry. It's never 100% of you. It's always a part of you, even if it's a big part of you. When we relate to our, so the anger, we relate to our anger in a healthy way, it is a data point for us. It's giving us information that we are experiencing something that we are witnessing, we believe is an injustice. When we relate to our anger in an unhealthy way, we're identified with it. We don't see it as an emotion per se, we're merged with it, we're blended with it. In other words, we're looking at the world through the lens of our anger. It's not a part of me is feeling angry, it's I am angry. I and the anger are one. So we've been hijacked by it. And on top of this, our anger has the charge of contempt. And for people who are not native English speakers, and I saw in the chat, people are coming in from all over the world. This is a term that this is a word that doesn't always translate easily, but contempt is, you could think of a contempt as like a blend of anger and judgment when you're judging someone. So more specifically, well, shame is the feeling of being inferior. Contempt is the feeling of being superior. And I'm sorry if you're going to have nightmares about this baby tonight, because it is like literally the most judgmental infant I've ever seen, or contemptuous infant I've ever seen. You can blame me if you wake up thinking about it. So contempt is the flip side of shame. So when we feel contempt, we have put ourselves on a higher rung of the ladder of moral worth, essentially. When we feel shame, we feel we're not worthy enough, we're less than, we feel contempt, we feel that we're more worthy than others. When we feel contempt, we can easily trigger shame in the person on the receiving end of our contempt, right? When they look at us, themselves through our eyes, they can feel very often, when somebody is looking at you and they're looking down on you and they're judging you. And research has shown that contempt is the one emotion most likely to destroy a sense of connection and well-being in a relationship. This isn't surprising. Think about how you feel when somebody in your life or somebody you're interacting with is feeling and expressing contempt towards you. You want to disconnect from them. They are not a safe person to be with. And you can very easily feel invisible and, in their presence. Now, shame and contempt are both data points. They are red flags, and they're red flags alerting us to the fact that we have lost connection with our empathy. With our empathy for others or our empathy for ourselves. You can empathize with yourself, right? So think about that for a moment. I've said our primary relationship is with ourselves. So when you feel shame or when you feel contempt, pause and ask yourself if there's a way to connect with your empathy, reconnect with your empathy. It's impossible to look down on or up at someone if you're looking at the world through their eyes. And shame and contempt are actually two sides. I call them two sides of the non-relational coin. They're two of the most disconnecting and non-relational of emotions. One can't exist without the other. Shame and contempt, think about this. Shame and contempt only exist in comparison. We can't feel less worthy if there's nobody who's more worthy with whom we're comparing ourselves. Even if the basis for our comparison is an idealized version of ourselves. How often do you shame yourself when you think about your ideal self and how your ideal self is and what you should be doing, what you would be doing? And we can only feel shame and contempt as well when we have bought into the myth of a hierarchy of moral worth. And this is really, really important. This is a myth. This is a belief that some individuals have more inherent worth than others, that some of us are born more worthy of being treated with respect and occupying space on this planet than others. This myth, when you think about the hierarchy of moral worth, this myth lies at the foundation of all harms to dignity and all forms of injustice. This is the core belief. We do not carry out harmful, disrespectful, contemptuous behaviors to somebody when we truly believe that they deserve to have their dignity honored, that they deserve fundamental respect. And, if you think about all of the unjust systems in the world, whether it's patriarchy, racism, carnism, speciesism, or so on, this belief is at the core of them. Certain groups, certain individuals are more worthy of being treated with respect, of having their interests honored than others. And this belief in a hierarchy of moral worth, it really reflects a profound misunderstanding of human psychology and behavior. And this is one of the reasons that we get caught up in it. Each one of us is really nothing more and nothing less than the synthesis of our hardwiring, the biology that we were born with, and every single experience we have ever had. How can we ever be different from that? So think about that for a moment. We are nothing more than the hardwiring, the biology we came down with, and every momentary experience we have had throughout our entire lives. That is who and how we are. So expecting people to be different from who and how they are, it's like expecting a tree that's been rained on not to be wet. This doesn't mean we shouldn't work to grow our awareness and evolve. It doesn't mean we don't hold people accountable. It is simply to say that the environment in which this work takes place is the result of factors that have shaped us into who we are, and that we need to honor dignity. Even as we hold people accountable, we need to honor their dignity. The non-relational behaviors that result from believing in this hierarchy of moral worth, they're often not recognized as dysfunctional because they're expressed through moral outrage. And, moral outrage today is like really celebrated all around the world. And many otherwise compassionate people believe today that feeling moral outrage basically gives them a free pass to act in ways that are unkind. And when you hear vegans criticizing other vegans vocally on YouTube and online, you can hear this moral outrage. You can see examples of what I'm talking about. So many vegans today feel justified in abusing someone, as long as that person is an abuser, or is abusive themselves, believing that these actions are helping to defend animals. We tend to assume that if someone isn't compassionate, then we shouldn't be compassionate toward them. But when you think about it, people who are more compassionate are people who simply have greater access to their compassion. Compassion is something that we have inside of ourselves that we have more or less access to at any given point in time. And most of us have greater access. I would say all of us have greater access or less access to our compassion because of our biology and our life experiences. I mean, just think about how you feel after like one bad experience. After you've been on the phone with Verizon or Vodafone or T-Mobile, wherever you live in the world, after you've been on the phone with your phone carrier for 45 minutes, waiting to get something critical fixed, and then you get disconnected. What has happened to your compassion after that 45 minutes? Imagine days and a lifetime of these kinds of like frustrations. So really think about this. Just as we would not look down on a starving person because they don't have as much access to food as we do, we should not look down on people who aren't able to access their compassion as much as we are. Being able to access our compassion is such a gift. It is incredibly painful to not have access to your compassion. It is incredibly painful, and it's usually a sign that you're in a pretty lousy place in your experience. So as I said, we need to hold others accountable and ourselves accountable while honoring dignity. And holding people accountable, it's not forcing them to accept blame. It's explaining the consequences of their behavior in a way that helps them to recognize their responsibility and feel motivated to act on it. If we could all do this to each other at our movement, we would open up dialogues that could help strengthen and deepen our understanding in pretty profound ways. And the most effective way to actually encourage change in others is to motivate them to want to change. And this is what all of the research shows, is to communicate and create an environment where they can see the benefit of changing. They feel safe enough to reflect on whatever we're holding them accountable about. And this helps them to be open to changing in the way that we would hope for them to. Okay, so I have mentioned dysregulation, I think, a couple of times now, and I'm going to define this and talk about it a little bit more fully now. And this is cause number 5. We have high levels of dysregulation in our movement. This is really important. I think I've said this like 10 times already. This is really important to be aware of, but this really is important to be aware of. When we are dysregulated, this basically means we're emotionally out of balance. More specifically, we are dysregulated when our nervous system is out of balance. You know what it feels like to be dysregulated because you've been dysregulated a gazillion times in your life. You might even be dysregulated right now. I don't know. When you're dysregulated, you feel maybe you're overstimulated, maybe you're exhausted, maybe you're triggered because somebody said something upsetting to you, maybe you're having a little bit of anxiety. Your nervous system is out of balance. And when you're dysregulated, you have less access to your rational faculties, as we were talking about when people are shamed. When people feel shame, they usually get dysregulated, and less access to your empathy. You might even just feel some sort of like an emotional charge. Everyone gets dysregulated at times, but I think that being vegan increases the chances that we'll become dysregulated because, as I said, we live in a world that daily offends our deepest sensibilities. We walk out the door, and we don't see meat trucks. We see trucks of dead body parts. We see people who we love putting dead animals in their mouths and treating us like something is wrong with us because we care. It's challenging, it's important, and it's challenging to be vegan in a dominant animal eating world. And as I said, when we're dysregulated, we're less rational, we're less empathic. And regulation exists on a spectrum. You can be severely dysregulated or you can be mildly dysregulated. Some people are chronically dysregulated. And I think this is true in our movement and therefore easily triggered, and they don't even know it. Most of us, most people are not aware of the fact that they're dysregulated. And then when you're not aware of the fact that you're dysregulated, you're more likely to inadvertently dysregulate others, because guess what? Dysregulation is contagious. In other words, dysregulated people dysregulate people. So dysregulation is contagious because it increases the likelihood that we'll engage in non-relational behaviors. When you're dysregulated, you're feeling wound up, you're angry, you're anxious, you're exhausted, whatever. You're probably a lot less likely to practice the formula, even if you want to. You're probably a lot more reactive and not thinking about how you're talking to other people, more defensive. And so when you're dysregulated and you engage in non-relational behaviors, then you can cause other people to become dysregulated, who then cause other people to become dysregulated, and so on and so forth. So one of the most important things that anybody can do in the movement or not is to learn how to self-regulate. I mentioned that we're going to launch a website soon, and that a lot of the sources, the references for this webinar will be on there. And also we have a ton more information, and we'll have a lot of great resources for how to self-regulate. But when you learn how to self-regulate, you learn how to bring yourself back into balance. You learn how to soothe your nervous system. One thing that you can do right now is you can just commit to asking yourself at least once a day, do I feel in balance? Does my nervous system feel in balance? And then ask yourself, what do I need to feel in balance? And give yourself permission to do that. If you are able to, give yourself permission to do that. If you could commit to meeting your needs for regulation on a daily basis and really say to yourself, I know that my regulation is the most important thing in my life and for this movement, because the more regulated you are, the more sustainable you are, the less likely you are to burn out, the less likely you are to contribute to infighting, and so many other things. If you can say to yourself every day, I am committed to keeping myself regulated, and check in with yourself and ask if you're regulated and give yourself permission to do what you need to regulate, you will keep yourself in balance, and you will become, if you aren't already, you will become that calm base for other people to help them get into a place of regulation as well. Because even though dysregulation is contagious, regulation is also contagious. When you're regulated and you can stay in that calm space, when people around you who are dysregulated, you can help bring them back into a calm space too. We're going to have resources to talk about how to do that. You can also write a list of your experiences of dysregulation to have on hand. And we have on the website, we have a sample list, so that you identify your emotions, you identify your thoughts, you identify your triggers, you identify what you need in order to soothe yourself, and so on. Okay, I think this is the final cause that we're going to be talking about today, which is that we have high rates of something called secondary traumatic stress. And I'm just going to briefly touch on this. We have a whole course on this at veganadvocacy.org. Secondary traumatic stress is similar to what you may be familiar with post-traumatic stress, PTSD. The only difference is that secondary traumatic stress affects the witnesses to violence, while PTSD affects the direct victims of violence. Many people in the vegan space have developed secondary traumatic stress because we're surrounded by traumatic material. Like how can we not be traumatized to some degree? STS is epidemic among vegans. It's also a leading cause of burnout. One of the things that is important to know for today anyway, is that secondary traumatic stress, it causes us to get dysregulated, and it also causes us to develop what I call traumatic thinking. Traumatic thinking is basically a mindset. When we're traumatized, we start to see the world as one giant traumatic event with only 3 roles to be played. Somebody can either be a victim in the trauma, or a perpetrator or a hero, not a witness, because a witness can be a hero if they help, or a witness can be a perpetrator if they don't. They can be a victim if they're harmed by the witnessing. So we start to put everybody into these three categories, and we lose our capacity for nuance. We think you're a good person or you're a bad person. If you're, heroes are all good all the time. And if you're not all good all the time, then, you must be a perpetrator. We lose our capacity for nuance, and we can end up developing this sort of like toxic moral perfectionism where we hold everyone, including ourselves, to these impossible standards, right? Feeling like if we're not perfect, then we're bad. Someone makes one unexamined or even one selfish choice or statement, and all of a sudden they're the perpetrator, they're the enemy, So we attack vegans who are drinking wine that isn't certified vegan wine, calling them animal exploiters, or we put vegans on pedestals, creating heroes, and then we just knock them off when they inevitably fall short. So this traumatic thinking contributes to infighting by causing us to divide up the people in our movement, not just outside our movement, but in our movement, into one of these three roles. And generally it's, the victim role is a whole other thing, but I think that's going to have to be another webinar. But generally, we tend to think of vegans in terms of perpetrators and heroes. And, perfectionism comes with the territory of being a visionary. And vegans are visionaries. We have a vision of the way the world could be, which often translates in our minds into the way the world should be. So we get frustrated. And of course, this makes sense. It's just important to not let the gift of your vision bring you and other vegans down. Do not let your vision bring you down. We need to relate to the world the way the world is, rather than the way we wish it were. Don't dress for warmth and sunshine when the forecast is for cold and rain, or we end up frustrating. So we have to make imperfect choices because we've inherited an imperfect world. So for example, maybe you have to feed your rescued cats meat because they can't tolerate the vegan cat food you normally use. In a perfect world, you wouldn't have rescued cats living with you, and you would not have to save one animal by supporting the slaughter of another. We've got to give ourselves permission to be the contradictory, complicated, very imperfect, fallible people we all are. We've been born into this relationally dysfunctional mess of the world. We did not create it, we inherited it. When you give yourself and others permission to be the messy people you are, and don't use the word hypocrite, talk about the contradictions that you live with and we all live with, then you give yourself and the people in your life and the people in this movement a great gift. So I want to just mention one last thing about secondary trauma, and then we're going to actually jump into the final part of this webinar, which is just a couple of minutes, and that'll give us a nice little chunk of time, hopefully for questions. One way that you can prevent and manage secondary traumatic stress is to witness carefully. And what this means is do not watch the graphic videos. Do not look at the graphic images. Do not take the trauma in. If you're already a part of the solution, you do not need to re-traumatize yourself. A lot of vegans feel guilty when they stop bearing witness to the trauma, but you're not helping the animals by traumatizing yourself. The best thing you can do for this movement is to practice the same compassion toward yourself that you want others to practice toward the animals. And then you become a healthy, self-connected, resilient individual who can be in this movement for the long haul and be as effective as you can possibly be. So give yourself permission to let your trauma go. Okay, so this is the final little part that we're going to talk about, and it's just a few of the costs of infighting that I wanted to go over because I said earlier that it costs the movement quite a bit, and we've talked a little bit about the huge costs that infighting comes at to individual advocates in the form of burnout and recidivism, which is quitting the movement or quitting being vegan even, despair, overworking, increased risk of secondary traumatic stress, self-neglect, and depression, and so on. And it also comes at a huge cost to organizations, and our organizations are like they're the the foundation of our movement in many ways. And when our organizations and groups are destabilized, our movement is destabilized. So I have a lot, it's going to be on the Infighting website. There's a ton of research that's been done on the impact of fighting in teams and within organizations in general. You know, I'm just going to give you like one example. One person who engages in what they call toxic behaviors, which are non-relational behaviors in a group, can actually reduce that group's performance by 30 to 40%. If we apply this to the movement as a whole, the movement level, we're talking about infighting making us almost half as effective at sparing animals' lives than we otherwise would be. And I talked a little bit about the financial costs to the movement, infighting related problems. You know, the animal advocacy budget is $200 million per year. We assume that it costs the farm animal advocacy movement between 5 to 10% of the annual budget. That's 10 to 20 million per year. And if we don't commit to ending infighting, the costs are probably going to grow. And that's because infighting is contagious. More specifically, the non-relational behaviors that contribute to that are infighting are contagious. And there's been interesting research on non-relational behaviors. Researchers have said that these behaviors actually spread like the common cold. So studies show that just being exposed to one incident of rude behavior, like reading an insulting email, can cause people to reproduce these behaviors, not only toward the person who is rude to them, but later on in the day to other people that they encounter, who then spread those behaviors further. So just like imagine the impact of a super spreading event, like driven by a vegan influencer who's communicating toxically, or like when the communication is funneled through the digital microphone of social media. And social media is where most communication takes place. And this is really like key. This is really critical because the primary way that infighting is carried out is through our communication. Communication is the primary way we relate, and most communication happens online. Social media is actually structured to prevent relational communication and accurate information. It is literally structured this way, and to encourage the opposite. Social media is also structured to dysregulate us and to cause our thinking to become increasingly shallow. So what this means is we have to, this is where I believe, this is where the focus of anybody who wants to prevent and end infighting needs to be, where the focus needs to be on social media and taking away, making it the norm on social media to communicate respectfully. This is a tall ask because we're working against the tides, right? But we can do that. And the good news is that relational behaviors are also contagious, just like non-relational behaviors are contagious. So just to conclude, I want to, a final point I want to stress is just how important it is to remember our mission, to remember our shared mission as vegans, as animal advocates. Every time we harm a vegan, we harm an animal. Every time we harm a vegan, she pays the price. Those of us who are working to end carnism are the only thing standing between their lives and their deaths. Edmund Burke said that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. And this is one of the most urgent things for us to remember if we hope to end infighting. Infighting is only epidemic because the majority of us are passively supporting it. One thing you can do right now to immediately stop and to help end infighting is to not be a bystander. And this means being much more attentive in your own communication, particularly online. Do not like, do not share, do not allow any toxic communication in your groups or on your feeds. You take away the platform. Make a commitment right now today to practicing relational communication. And the good news is that we've got this. I really do think we've got this. If we can take on the massive industry of animal exploitation, we can heal our movement. It's really just a matter of choosing and also knowing how to heal. Healing our movement is one of the most important, one of the most impactful things we can do to further our mission, to become even more effective than we already are. And all around the world, support for veganism is growing. And I have little doubt that veganism will one day replace carnism as the dominant ideology. For me, the question is not whether, but when. And so, and the sooner we can heal our movement, the sooner we can realize our goal of ending animal exploitation. And so I'm just going to wrap up here so that we have some time, 10 minutes now for some questions and discussion. But I just want to end with a big thank you, for all you are, for all you do, for being here, for, being a part of this incredibly, incredibly important change. You're such an inspiration to me. And I'm just so grateful to be able to be here and be connecting with you. So a big thank you to you. And I'll end my screen share in a minute. I'm going to share with you a few resources and then we can open up to dialogue. So thank you. My new book that just came out a couple of weeks ago is How to End Injustice Everywhere. You can get it at Amazon, anywhere, infighting.org. It's great if you do get it and you like it and you can rate it, because that will really help it get into the right hands of people. Our website, infighting.org, is going to have a tremendous amount of resources, way beyond what I've talked about here today. At veganadvocacy.org, we have courses, we have webinars, we have videos, we have all sorts of materials. Most of them are free. What's not free is donation only. So if you can't afford to pay, you can access pretty much everything that we offer. And we are a service organization. We exist in the service of you. So please use us. You can visit carnism.org. You can visit veganadvocacy.org. If you're interested in building relational literacy, my book, Getting Relationships Right, is a one-stop guide to building relational literacy. It's not focused on veganism. It's focused on relationships in general. Great for people who are not interested in talking about veganism, but want to develop their empathy skills and learn relational skills. And Beyond Beliefs is a guide to building relational literacy with a focus on vegan, non-vegan, or vegan relationships. So I'm going to stop my share here and
oh my goodness, Melanie,
open it up.
You are unbelievable. Thank you so much. I mean, I work in this realm, as you know, and seeing your Infighting presentation about almost a year and a half ago or a year ago, I was just like, she's put it all together and she's woven it all together. It's amazing. Okay, so I want to jump into questions because we don't have much time left. And I've sort of chosen a few that really encapsulate some of the questions that were coming up. One thing that this is a really quick one, but Drew was asking, will the website have any examples of historical social movements and how they overcame infighting and achieved success? Because I think some people are still like, are you sure that this is really hurting? And is it actually possible to get over this? And have other social movements been able to achieve this?
That's a really good question. That's actually a great question. So I don't know a single social movement that doesn't have infighting. And this is why infighting.org is not just for vegans. It's for anybody working for progressive change will hopefully find resources and tools on that for them. I don't believe that we will ever fully end infighting because people, I mean, people are people, but if we don't need all vegans to be fully relationally literate. We just need enough vegans to be relationally literate enough, so that the scales of, so that the movement itself becomes more balanced toward healthy relationality. And I think with awareness, I mean, we've never talked about, we've talked about infighting, but usually to complain about it. So, but we haven't actually taken the issue on fully. So we don't really know what's possible until we have a solution or a set of solutions and start trying to utilize them.
Excellent. Okay, so Elijah had a really great question. It's long, but it's good, and it reflects a couple of other folks. And it's, how do we reconcile situations where people with social economic power are overwhelming or actively silencing other voices in our movement? They're rarely hostile or rude, but are sometimes obstructing the movement on a larger scale than any poor interpersonal communication. I'm thinking well-funded, capitalist-minded organizations who deliberately direct funding away from anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-colonial forms of activism. Polite, friendly leadership who leverage their power to silence, harm others. And so basically just saying that this presentation might be framing the infighting unequally that it unequally targets those that have inherently less power in the movement, who don't have the privilege of the politeness that comes with power. So just, can you address
Yeah.
that?
Well, first of all, I want to be really careful not to conflate respect and politeness. One can be respectful and very direct in their communication. And in fact, sometimes direct communication and direct action itself, is necessary. And you can still do that in a way that is respectful. And as I said in the beginning, it's really important to acknowledge that infighting is not in disagreeing, and it's not silencing. It's not about silencing the voices of those who are challenging power in the movement or power imbalances in the movement. I would say that, there were a couple of statements that the person asking the question made, which was, they're using their power, what does it say? Leveraging their power to silence others. And I want to be really careful about making assumptions about why people are doing what they're doing. There seem to be assumptions that there are organizations that are intentionally taking money and resources from other organizations, and organizations that are intentionally leveraging power to silence other voices. And I think we need to be careful about making assumptions about what somebody's intentions are when they haven't made those explicit, because that kind of thing that can create more, they can make it even more difficult to have the conversations that need to be had. So and this is something I actually talk about. I have a 4-hour version of this. That's an in-person training, which we get into in much more detail, this in much more detail. So there's no easy answer to this person's question, because it's not a simple single question. It's really, what I would say is, the more, let me back up. There are conversations that need to be had in the movement, and power needs to be challenged in the movement in ways that help balance power out more in the movement. And this is true in other movements. This is true in the world in general. There's no question about that. And the more skilled we can be, and I don't want to put the onus or the burden on people with less power to have to communicate perfectly. And I think this might be part of the question. Like, so often people who are challenging power have the burden on themselves to have to do it in a way that's perfect, or that's skillful. And that creates an added burden for them. And I don't want to add to that. I will say, however, building communication skills and building awareness of power dynamics in general will help you, however you decide to challenge the power, will help you to be more effective in doing so.
And I think, Melanie, I think one thing that maybe people aren't quite understanding is that one can be in a regulated place and, have a sort of generosity in their hearts, but still stand up in a very sort of fierce way against bad behavior.
Yeah, I mean, we can stand, there's this, it's interesting because I have often been accused of, sometimes been called being soft, having a soft approach, because I'm promoting non-shaming and I'm promoting honoring dignity. And it's interesting. I perceive that generally people who say that to me are men, actually. And, I do think there's some gendered sort of piece to this assumption that, being relational somehow means being weak, and promoting compassion means not having strength. I would say that you're absolutely right. We can stand up, we can speak out when we speak truth to power. If we can do that, the way Desmond Tutu advocated, speaking from a place of compassion and speaking to dignity, we can do that with a tremendous amount of strength and force. And we're much more likely to attract people to support our cause, than we are to turn people off to our cause, whatever that cause may be.
One more question.
Sure.
What if the object of shame, this is Drew, what if the object of shame is not meant to feel shame? Corporations and CEOs are publicly shamed in campaigns, but the goal is not to make them feel shame, it's to make the public see them negatively and impact their bottom line, which often works.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So I think I want to keep the focus actually on the vegan movement and how we interact with each other. And I'd say there's a lot of, but this is a very, very good question. And I think there's a way to be holding accountable and demonstrating, so shaming is communicating that an individual being, human being, or here we're talking about human beings, right? An individual has less inherent worth, less fundamental worth than others. Corporations don't have fundamental worth because they're not living beings. That said, you can raise that said, corporations like vegan organizations, and this is where I think it gets a little bit, and maybe it's a little bit easier to see, they are made up of people, and there are people who are identified with these organizations. So I have heard vegan leaders, a number of vegan leaders have sat across from me and openly wept at what was said about their organizations. You're just trying to get money. You're just doing what you're doing because you want to garner donations for your own organization. You're just doing what you're doing because you want to make a name for yourself as a vegan in the movement, or a name for your organization, I should say. These organizations are made up of people, and they're people who are identified with the organization. And in the case of vegan organizations, these are vegans who care very much about their impact on animals and can be incredibly, incredibly hurt by this kind of communication. I think you can, when it comes to a corporation, you certainly can engage in communication that raises awareness of the harm that's done in a way that is careful not to shame the individuals that are part of that organization. Because that's really what we want to do. The shame will come. I mean, people will feel ashamed of being associated with the organization if the organization, or I should say the corporation, is exposed for their bad behaviors.
So, in just to follow up with that, so this is a question that's been coming up, just like sort of white fragility in the anti-racism movement, there are a lot of animal advocates who may be trying their best not to shame someone, but because of the fragility of other folks, and this could be, other folks in the movement, how do you reconcile when you have not done anything to shame, like you've done all the right things, but someone is still activated? How do you work with that?
Yeah, white fragility is actually a really good example, or male fragility. I actually write about this in my book, The Vegan Matrix, which is about how to talk about privilege and oppression in the vegan movement, power, privilege, and oppression in the vegan movement in a way that reduces the triggeredness, ideally, and defensiveness around the conversation. But you can communicate in a way that is non-shaming, and it does not mean the other person won't be ashamed. But you've stayed on your side of the street. The only thing that you are in control of is your own behaviors. You are not in control of people's responses to your behaviors. So you have to not be, too invested in the outcome. And, that's what I would say.
Okay, Melanie, I know you have to run.
Thank
and
you.
This has been just a beautiful time with you. Thank you for your generosity. This is again a talk that she has done in venues where there's high ticket prices to be paid, and here she is offering this to us for out of the generosity of her heart. So Melanie, thank you so much. And also, I would just like to remind everybody about Melanie's new book, which is out there right now. And we're going to drop that into the chat again. Melanie, you had something else to say. I can see that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I forgot to mention. So I give this, as I mentioned, I give this workshop. It's a 4-hour version of this, a half-day workshop. And if anybody is interested in, especially here in Europe where I live, if you feel like you could, you wanted to host, if you wanted to host a training in your country, and we could get, a group of people in your country to come, particularly people who are, really active in the movement, representing different organizations, please contact us at info@carnism.org, and we can talk about doing that. As I said, all of our services, everything that we offer is donation only, and we're free to people who can't afford to pay for our services. So definitely get in touch at info@carnism.org if you think you'd like one of these trainings in your country or your region.
And the book End Injustice Everywhere, we just dropped that in the chat. Again, the link. We need to promote you too, Dr. Melanie Joy. And I would love to hear if is this a 4-hour workshop? Can it be done online if we were to bring you in for a half-day training? Melanie?
Thank you for that. I haven't done it online before right now. I'm just because it's there's a lot of experiential exercises and conversation exercises, but you know, perhaps at some point. At the moment, it's not yet.
Okay.
But thank you.
You know, we got to always have breakout rooms ready. So
Yeah.
thank you, Melanie. We wish you were here in Canada with us.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
So I want everybody to give Melanie an Animal Justice Academy big thank you. Okay, everybody, let's give a big thank you to Melanie.
Big thank you.
so much, Melanie.
This is incredible.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all of you for being here. We so appreciate you all.
Pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Go forward and let's change this world for animals. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.